Go ahead and get started. Quick sound check. Diane and Dr. Akra, are you able to hear
I
me?
can
Hello.
hear you, and hi, good morning.
Good morning. Excellent. Okay.
Good morning.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Amelia Hufford. I'm the Senior Vice President of Clinical and Regulatory Science at 3Aware. Briefly, 3Aware is a leading real-world data and data analytics platform that serves specifically the med tech industry. I have with me today Diane Legere. Currently, Diane is a Senior Clinical Auditor for the notified body DNV. Prior to this, she has held lead clinical evaluation roles within BSI and also on the manufacturer side for companies such as Juul Labs and Philips. She has over 3 decades of experience in the clinical field, starting her career as a nurse and gaining experience in clinical research. So we are very happy to have you here today, Diane, to share your insight and your expertise.
Thank you.
We also have Dr. Basila Akra. Dr. Akra is the founder, CEO, and executive consultant of Akra Team, a premier consultancy organization consisting of regulatory, clinical, and quality experts in the healthcare industry. Prior to consulting, Dr. Akra had held executive leadership roles within one of the largest notified bodies to have sued. But his service as a subject matter expert in Europe on the Association of Notified Bodies has led to the creation of several key guidance documents and importantly has helped frame our understanding of clinical evidence expectations under MDR. So thank you, Dr. Akra, for sharing your expertise today.
Thank you, Amelia and 3Aware, for inviting us to be with you here today.
Excellent. Well, I can't think of a better guest to start this discussion. So I will be moving straight into our first topic today. And let's see if I can navigate the screen. So our first topic today is an interesting one that we've heard both in discussions with clients, but also in attending conferences specific to EU MDR. Around the use of basically US data for EU clinical data needs. And not just US data, but really any out of European data. So Dr. Akra, I'd like to start with you. From the EU legislation point of view, what is the requirement for manufacturers in collecting data from EU sites?
Thank you, Amelia, for this very interesting question and very important question as well. When we talk about European medical device regulation, a lot of people start blaming the legislation for being too complex and includes a lot of high requirements, which are actually challenging for the system. Thanks God, the legislation doesn't include any specific expectation on having data which are coming from a specific region. So the European legislation talks about actually the requirement on clinical evidence, which shall be sufficient, and those clinical evidence shall include clinical data for some devices. Some other devices might be exempted from clinical data based on their characteristics and their functionality. But for the devices that require clinical data, manufacturers are required to have relevant clinical data. This is what is important. And relevant clinical data means that those data should be relevant to the European population. And those data can come from various regions. It doesn't matter where they are coming from, as long as they are relevant for the European population, and they can be actually addressing the questions on safety, performance, and clinical benefit, which is connected to a specific device. And this is the most important point which we need to consider. So there is no challenge on whether the data come from Europe or the US or China or other regions, as long as they are relevant. So manufacturers need to challenge the data. Even if the data are coming from the European Union, they need to challenge the data to check whether those data are actually answering my questions, which I need to answer for my initial certification, recertification, or expansion of my indication, intended purpose, whatever I'm planning to do. Because if those data which you have at this moment are not answering your question, it's not about actually the source of it. It's about actually that the questions are not addressed or not addressed in a sufficient way.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I've often thought about this question as being overly generic. As you can think, there's a lot of differences that occur within a country, let alone across countries. And anytime you're assessing data from one location or one even type of site,
yeah.
you need to understand the differences across that site. And from a scientific perspective, it would seem overly restrictive to actually suggest you shouldn't collect data from a certain area or certain region. So because, as you said, it's really the totality of evidence.
Which if I can interrupt you, if we look to actually a declaration of Helsinki, from an ethical point of view, and this is where also the FDA took a step back and said, actually, we accept and recognize data from other sources. This is actually very important because from an ethical point of view, it doesn't make sense to repeat data collection if you have data. And you cannot actually just disregard the data if they are relevant and are addressing your question. Because at the end, the expectation is always the same, because the expectations comes from the patients, from the users, and the expectation on the safety output and the performance output should be always the same for a human being, because you can't actually say for a human in the US, I have less expectation on safety than a human being in Europe. So the expectation should be coming from a state of the art, and the state of the art is coming from fundamental scientific research, understanding what is actually the benefit risk profile expectation for a specific device, for a specific intended purpose. And this should guide us actually to decide what kind of data is necessary, and is not actually where is these data coming from. Important is the quality, the relevance, and actually the way how the data were collected is important to address actually what we are looking for.
Thank you very much. And just to double click that, is there, from a legislative point of view, written into the medical device regulation, is there a requirement for a specific amount of that data from Europe?
As I mentioned before, I mean, and I am one person who read the legislation since actually in its initial drafting. There is nothing in the legislation, not even discussed at any time, that there is a requirement that you collect a specific amount of patient number from a specific region. So there is nothing in the legislation like that. All what the legislation is talking about actually clinical data which are relevant to address safety and performance of a device. And this is important, which are relevant for the European population, but it's not talking about actually having the data to be collected in Germany. And I mean, if you look to Europe, even European Union and Europe, and you have multiple countries,
right,
multiple ways how they deal with the device. And who is European? Even US data might have much more European citizens data than having actually data from Europe itself, because it's all about actually, you don't ask in a study, what is actually your passport, and are you actually a citizen, or are you actually born in that country? So it's important to talk about actually reflection of reality of the real data, instead of talking about where is the data coming from, because at the end, the clinical practice, the patient population, the methodology applied are relevant, but the question is, are those influencing my clinical data? And this can be justified and discussed in the documentation. But as I mentioned, there is nothing in the legislation which is talking about specific amount of patient coming from a specific country.
Thank you. Diane, I'd like to ask you then, since there's no requirement from legislation, can a notified body require EU clinical data?
Can a notified body require
European clinical data despite the lack of that requirement in the EU MDR?
Yeah, so as Dr. Akra talked about, there's nothing in the requirements that we can make that request for, that we can ask for. So I'm just going to echo what he mentioned, we look at scientific validity, we look at fit for purpose, we look at, is your data able to answer the relevant questions that are specific to your device and how it's working and who it's working with, what's the environment it's working in. And we looked to see how your data answers those questions specifically. So there isn't anything in the legislation, as Dr. Akra said, but in the CECP, when you look at their responses, there are a couple of mentions there looking at post-market data and asking about why isn't there any data coming from the European Union. More of a question, obviously, there than a requirement.
Yeah, that's a good piece I'd like to ask you next about. So when a manufacturer is putting together their the documentation, what should they consider and justify to notified bodies when assessing data transferability? I think Dr. Akra mentioned, the differences in standard of care. But what do you look at specifically in those types of justifications?
Yeah, I think that's just a good scientific background. So I look at, for all types of data, what are the threats to validity? How representative is the population? If you're doing electronic health records, like we were talking about, what hospitals did you choose? What socioeconomic areas were they from? How did the manufacturer plan for missing data? Obviously some of the real world data sources aren't fit for regulatory. They didn't, that wasn't their intent. So how are you taking that data to fit the purpose that you're using? And so, when we look at MDCG 2027, sometimes I forget the numbers, but, there's a whole section C that talks about justify, rationalize, plan. So I look to that guidance as well when I'm reviewing, and I consider all of those. So how comprehensive is your data? Is it patient-centered? Those are the types of things that I'm evaluating.
Excellent. And Dr. Akra, I didn't know if you had any additional thoughts around, for instance, what if there are, slight differences in clinical practice? Obviously, you could see that there could be differences in clinical practice, not just from Europe to US, but within regions, within a community hospital versus an academic institution. So how, where would a manufacturer start to help kind of put that together?
I mean, it is the typical answer that a notified body will give you always is it depends, because it depends is this difference. So if we are referring to a device approved in the US for a different indication, it's a different topic to discuss, and you are actually talking about the steps that the physician will be applying to introduce a device. Might have like the way how they do it is a bit different. Then you look to it, does it impact the clinical outcome? Because some of these differences might be related to usability, but it doesn't have an impact on the safety and performance of the device. But if they are actually introduced in a way which might impact the data, then the data can be used as supportive, but not the main evidence. So we need to look always case by case, and this is the job of the manufacturer to justify it and discuss it in the clinical evaluation report at the end to say if the data will be used, why they concluded that those data are sufficient. And in some cases, this is where PMCF can be very helpful. Then a confirmatory activity will need to happen on a post-market level. And then going back to the expert panel and their feedback that they asked about why no further PMCF are done in Europe is connected actually to two aspects. The first aspect is those are scientists, those are physicians, those are clinicians that want to do research in Europe. So they want to support European research. And if they see that everything is done out of the European Union and you are seeking CE marking, which means you are seeking CE conformity assessment and you want to get the device on the European market. So they would like to see also activities happening in Europe. This is not written in the legislation. It's actually their scientific willingness to say, I want to support clinical data collection in Europe. The other point is also connected to what I said before. If you have some differences, if you have differences in usability, and you justify they are actually not impacting safety and performance, then at least you need to confirm it on a European usage. And this is where you would need to have a PMCF on a European level to say, it is actually, if I get the data, it shows me that there is no difference and there is no impact. The same thing, you would do it as well if you are applying equivalency, because the European legislation, including the guidance MDCG 2020-5 regarding equivalency, allow manufacturer for class 2A to be non-implantable devices to compare their devices on an equivalency approach to non-European approved device. And if you compare to non-European approved device and use the data of a non-European approved device, they would need at least a confirmation before the recertification, which shows that actually applying that device in Europe for that intended purpose, for that indication, will lead to the same kind of data, same kind of output, or even better. But those data would need to be collected then on a European level to help actually the transferability of the data to help your justification and support you on recertification process. So there are actually 2 points which we need to take out of that. My question regarding where the data are coming from, it depends on actually the fact whether I'm coming with initial certification or I'm coming to recertification. And if I'm relying initially on data just from other sources, and I want to confirm that actually the other sources are also valid for my European source, then I might need to include an arm in the European level because of the fact that there are some differences. But if there are no differences, then I would not need that. The other point is, if I have data in the European Union and I'm planning to collect data post-market, there is nothing actually in the legislation would tell you to collect all the data in Europe. All what you need to have data on your device, on the safety and performance of the device. And you can use actually a combination of data sources, Europe, non-European, and this is what a lot of manufacturers successfully do over years. And there are some countries where there are established systems in place where you can collect data. And all what we need is actually data over the expected lifetime of a device in a post-market level. And you need to have a solid database which enable you to collect the data efficiently and also in a way which help you continuously learning about your device. And studies are not always as easy as actually other sources, because you can run a study for 1, 2, 3 years, but you can't run a study, which you can, but it is very costly and non-efficient, but you will not do a study for 10 years or 20 years. And the expectation that you keep collecting data, especially for long-term implantable devices, over their expected lifetime. And therefore, you need to think out of the box. And European system doesn't have a lot of sources which will help you on that ability to collect the data. So you might need to rely on data sources which are coming from a different country.
Yeah, I would add to that in my reviews with post-market planning, I have started having a much more conversation about sustainability in looking at data collection, to your point, Dr. Akra, and that often manufacturers come in and think about this one application. And to your point, we need to have data for the lifetime of the device, and some of them are, as you said, 10 or more years. And so that has become much more a part of my assessment and conversation, is really think about creating a sustainable solution to collecting meaningful data. And to your other points, of looking at patient burden and not making, and caregiver burdens. Like, so, you know, no one has time clinically to be filling out sort of these surveys and, you know, in the last year, how many safety events have you had? It's like, I don't know. I don't remember, you know, that are very much relying on recall. So I think thinking about burden to both the caregiver and the patients and sustainability is really important.
Yeah, and we need to be also careful on how we collect the data. Like you said, a survey might be helpful for some devices, but does it really help me without actually, and by getting the right answer, the valid answer, especially if you are dealing with devices which are implantable or supportive devices and so on. You might ask questions to a physician, to users, and like you said, I don't know anymore after 1 or 2 years what happened. But if you would use, for example, real-world evidence, this is documented evidence where you can rely back on records, then you see actually what was documented. Because what that physician cannot remember, it's perhaps written in a protocol or written in a report, which would allow then the data to be more reliable, unbiased, because it's based on evidence and not based on what do I remember or are not remembering. And I remember when I was at the hospital and we did some of these studies and we got some of these survey. I remember some of the physicians telling me, yes, I gonna fill all of that. I have everything in brain. I don't know anything which happened yesterday anymore. So how could you actually remember everything and keep all the data in your brain, and you know which patient had which infection, or which patient had which? You might have it for a direct day which you had, or you had a special case which you can remember, but you will not remember all the cases, and you will not be actually reflecting reality. So and therefore we need to rely on data sources for specific devices which help us ensure continuous improvement of devices by relying on evidence which are documented evidence. And I think there are multiple sources, and every source of data collection, including studies, real-world evidence, or survey, they are useful and helpful for a specific purpose, but not always one solution will fit all. You need to consider what I'm dealing with. Is it a pre-market, post-market? I'm trying to collect data on an implantable device, or I'm trying to collect data on a supportive device, or I'm trying to collect data on a non-invasive, non-implantable device. All these kind of questions you need to ask at the beginning. And if the duration will become very long, then you need to look to avoid actually methods which are not reliable anymore, because long-term data collection would mean you need to have a better control on it. And the better control is actually reality, which is real-world evidence, when you are looking long-term, bigger data, wider data, and especially as well when you want to understand how is the device used in the real environments. One of the requirements of the MDR talk about identification of off-label use, misuse, and a lot of people send survey, and I saw survey coming out to physicians asking them, do you use our device off-label? I don't know which physician will be clever enough to sign such a document and say, yes, every time I'm using off-label. No one will do that. So therefore, real-world evidence would be actually the better approach to see how did they apply the device, and to help you understand, is it actually systematic misuse, off-label use, or is it actually a single case?
I really like to kind of sit with this for a second, because I've seen this a lot, and I remember seeing this, you know, with when working with clinical teams. Is I think the understanding that post-market clinical follow-up is not just a single measure activity. It's I think folks are comfortable with clinical studies. I think folks feel like that's the gold standard for every single research question that needs to be asked. But again, you're not going to understand how the products are utilized in the real world. You're not going to be seeing off-label use. You know, sometimes studies aren't the best approach for answering the questions that are important, depending on the, you know, the specific device. And in fact, sometimes the general methods are the best way to kind of draw from signals and get certain key points. So I really think it's important for the community to understand that it's not just being uncomfortable with certain study designs. Sometimes you really need to look to certain study designs to answer the questions you're wanting to answer.
Totally agree. And I mean, studies are important. We cannot skip them.
Right.
But the point is, do I need a study? Especially when we look to the MDR. The MDR is actually a restart of an ongoing system, which means it's actually we have a directive since the 90s, and now we are actually switching off and switching on the system and saying now every device needs to revalidate its ability to be kept on the market. And do you do a repeated study for every device? And a lot of people were running out, doing survey, doing activities. But for some devices, it might not make any sense. And also, it might not be, might not find the resources, the professional scientists who are willing to do studies for you, who are interested to do studies, because their interest is in research, in innovative research, because they want to do something attractive. They want to publish something which is reasonable. And therefore, you need to think out of the box, and you need to think in an efficient way, because everything which is generated is cost, and every cost will be transferred to the healthcare system. And some of the costs can be transferred easily when you are dealing with complex devices and complex implantable devices. But if you are dealing with standard devices where the cost is not anymore like to be transferred, people will not do it, and you might lose a lot of technologies which are actually important and relevant for the patient, for the healthcare system, just because of the fact that that physician, that hospital cannot be able anymore to use it, and also the provider is not willing to cover the costs because they cannot afford it and reflect it to the healthcare system. So based on that, the devices will be kicked out of the market without a justification on being unsafe or not performing as intended. All why they are doing that is the fact that they are not willing to do additional new studies.
No, I think that's very important. I want to kind of grow that part of the conversation and switch to another topic. In particular, I want to understand, beyond region differences, when we're thinking about data transferability, what are some key considerations for considering, assessing the relevance of real-world data? Before we dive into that, though, I want to take a moment to invite all of the webinar attendees to submit questions in the chat function. We're going to be monitoring those questions, and then as the discussion progresses and towards the end, we would love to be able to ask Dr. Akra and Diane Legere your questions you might have for them regarding these topics. So please feel free, submit those questions in the chat function of the application. So Diane, in addition to assessing, as we talked about the possible population differences and standards of care differences, which would be required for any type of study design, what are some other data considerations that manufacturers must consider when utilizing real-world data? For example, you mentioned MDCG 2020-7, and that guidance document talks about, the data needs to be of sufficient quality, and it must be reliable. If you're wanting to use, for example, data coming from an electronic health record, how would you do that? How would you, where would you start to kind of justify that data is of sufficient quality and reliable?
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of that in our prior conversations. And again, just applying scientific, validity principles and looking at, again, justifying your approach, justifying your design, justifying the patient population that you're using to represent others. If you're looking at generalizability, looking at, possible, if you're looking at health records, so errors in coding and how you're going to manage that, looking at missing data and how you're going to manage that. So again, I think these are all, we're calling it real world data now, but applying scientific methods and validity is no different. The questions are the same. And, MDCG 2027 mentions real world data, but then further on, all the, aim, the aim of the study and justifying it's appropriate for surveys, it's appropriate for all approaches to data. So I think just remembering those scientific principles, as I said, to when you're looking at what data source you're going to look at, what approach to data, clinical data you have. So that's what I look at when I'm looking at why you chose that, why it's going to answer, does it answer safety and performance questions that you have? Is there a chance in your approach to look at off-label use, like we talked about? A question, as Dr. Akra stated, just asking, do you use this off-label? No one, no one is going to put themselves out there liability-wise and just say yes, or if they even know what that is. They use it for why they think it's appropriate for the patient that they're treating, period. So to them, that's not off-label. Probably haven't read the IFU anyways at the end of the day. So again, just applying scientific principles to make sure that your approach is valid and answers the questions that you need to have answered.
In addition, I'm thinking one of the challenges that is faced with real-world data is being able to link a specific patient procedure to a specific device. When you're reviewing post-market clinical follow-up plans that propose the use of real-world data, what are your expectations as far as that linkage? Do you need to know the catalog number? Do you need to know how specific and how closely linked does that need to be? Because I know that's a significant challenge in this area.
It is absolutely. Looking at everyone asking for basic UDI/IDIs to be part of the documentation, and we're certainly not there yet. So that's absolutely a question that I have when I look at their data. How did you match that this was your device and this is your outcome? How did you deal with that? So mostly manufacturers will, some data they know, some data they don't. And what is their plan to manage that? That's what I look at, because I appreciate the data set's not perfect, and that's something we all own and have to live within.
It's not a problem just from real world evidence. It's also like, real world evidence is wider than a lot of people would believe, even in publications, which is actually the current literature available, and the source which is used by a lot of manufacturers to justify safety and performance. In a lot of cases, you find the name of the device, you will not find, no one will publish about the catalog number. So they will talk about the name of the device. Preferably, they will talk about also like the sizes, the dimensions. Sometimes they don't have any such an information, and the manufacturer would need still to justify and explain why those data, as Diane was mentioning, are actually the data which going to be addressing my worst case scenario, and explaining that this would be actually enabling me to justify safety and performance. So every single source of data is actually connected with limitations, and it's the responsibility of the manufacturer to appraise the data from the various sources, and to say which data will be used for which purpose. And they need to come to a conclusion that whether those data which they have in front of them are sufficient or not. And sometimes if the data are not sufficient, they need to do additional data collection. Some other times they might not need to do additional data collection on a pre-market, but they can do it on a post-market. So it depends on what is actually the missing data, and what is actually the questions that they still need to address. And this is an important step which has to happen systematically at the beginning, before deciding whether my data are sufficient or not. And even the legislation tell you that manufacturers are responsible to define how much data is necessary to justify safety and performance of their device. It's not actually that there is a recipe in place which is saying you need to have 100 patients from that specific patient population, from that specific location, which you need to collect to get an approval in Europe. No, the legislator were clever enough to say, it's not our job to tell you how to do it. You need to tell us why is it sufficient in a scientific, solid way. And you need to do that by considering the characteristic of the device, intended purpose of the device, and all of that would need to play an important role before deciding on how much data will be relevant and sufficient to address safety and performance.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the literature part. I notice a lot more in professional guidelines that there's a call for coming together and looking at what data points we should be collecting, and also looking at, like you said, putting the names of the devices in the publications so that they have greater utility, because we talked about patient burden earlier, and having to repeat studies and put patients through this, obviously the cost, but again, the patient burden, and that data is already there often. And we can increase the utility by just sort of doing some minor tweaks, if you will, to align outcomes across different publications, different studies, and something as simple as you said is adding the names of the devices in the publications.
Yeah, those are excellent points, and I think there's steps that users can lean on when they're assessing certain data sources. I think we talked about, right, if they're able to get that connection between the device and the patient, or at least, you know, if it's not the UDI, can it be the catalog number? There's also, I mean, I think when you're assessing, for instance, you know, electronic health records, well, what is available in the structured format versus what are the, you know, relevant covariates that I need to be able to see that impact, you know, the outcomes that I'm assessing. For instance, you know, am I going to be able to understand possible comorbidities from the data that's presented? Is there enough detail that describes the procedure? Often that's lacking in the structured format, but do I have access to clinician notes, and what do those clinician notes contain? Those are some of the things that I think about when trying to assess, you know, the study question and the data source. Longitudinality is a big one. I think we talked about the expectation of collecting data on permanent implants beyond, you know, three years. As you mentioned, the burden to the patient, the caretaker, the healthcare system, and you know, bringing the patients back for follow-up. You know, it may not seem, you know, physically burdensome or intrusive, but the act of getting patients there, I think it's unfeasible. It's not feasible to collect data after a certain period of time. So, you know, when I'm looking at this real-world data source, can I longitudinally trace patients across their continuum of care? If as you mentioned, Diane, if that data is already there, you know, it relieves so much of that burden that would be required from study follow-up perspective.
I mean, there is one additional point which I always valued with, let's say, post-market data, because real-world evidence means post-market data. When I was at a notified body, and as of today as well, I always say, whatever we do on a clinical study level, on a pre-market level, is nothing else that actually getting a better stomach feeling about the device, its safety and performance. Why? Because when you do a study, you would do it in the best hospital by using the best physician, by selecting actually the preferred patients. So you are actually by design trying to get good data, and it's not reality. Reality is actually what happens really by the standard usage of the device, by multiple physicians for multiple patients with different starting point. This will tell you actually much more about your device. And the other point, which is important, when you study a device, you are studying one single device in a study. But when you are, especially when you are dealing with implantable devices, you have a lot of additional devices which can contribute to that study. And those devices, you will not collect data on them for any purpose. But when you are doing a real-world data collection, you are actually in a standard practice collecting on every single device, on the guide wire, on the catheter, on the syringe, on the cannulas, on the surrounding additional devices. You are collecting data. And based on that, this would help you actually doing a holistic post-market surveillance than having actually just a specific per device, which is from an efficiency point of view, from a scientific point of view, from a clinical point of view, much more reasonable than actually just focusing on one specific device on a post-market level. And looking to the questions in the chat, and I saw one of the questions which is asking is like, and going back to the same questions, can we use US data? The answer in general is always you can use non-European data, regardless if it's US or other region. Important is that you justify that those data are relevant. Now, you might have some differences. Now, if your US indication is wider than the European one, you are not in trouble. But if it's totally different, then it might be a trouble unless you find scientific literature which would allow you to support your transferability justification. And this is sometimes what you need to look to. So you can't build an argument. Don't use that sentence. We believe, we hope, we think. Just use a sentence which is saying, we did a systematic search, we found literature, and those literature support our arguments. Don't try to justify it in a subjective way, because then the notified body will say we are a different opinion. But if you give them actually scientific evidence which show that actually the data from source A can be used in source B, and there is evidence on that, or you found evidence that actually the usage of a device, because some devices are general devices which are used in various locations in the body. And there are studies which shows you actually, if you study that device in one area, you can apply it in other areas. And those kind of scientific transferability conclusions are important to be supported by scientific evidence. And the scientific evidence is not a single case that you will find out. So it should be a solid literature which will help you. And this is acceptable by the various notified bodies. And Diane is here to comment on that from her perspective, but I heard actually, and I saw that in submission by various notified bodies, when you come to them with a scientific justified, let's say, reason why you are using data, they will not challenge you. They want to see that you did your job. They want to understand how you came to which conclusion. And you need to help them actually understanding your device, understanding your data, understanding your source. You just need to document it in a reasonable way. Don't come to them and say, I have US data. This is all what I have. Come to them and say to them, I have clinical data, which are from a US source, and they are acceptable for the European population and for my European indication because of this or that.
Yes, agreed. I want to see a clear, I don't want to have to guess. I don't want to have to go searching. Don't expect me to go and do a literature search to find why this is okay. As Dr. Acker said, that's your job. That you need to lay it out so that I can follow it easily and see your justification and understand your justification.
And when you see, I think the question included, you know, the diagnosis is ultimately the same, even though there's very minor wording differences in the EU versus the US indications. They're still being asked. The notified body reviewer is still pushing for data to be collected in the EU population. So the thought is, if you're getting that, you're there's something missing. You need to present to them more of that scientific justification as to why this is appropriate, why it's an appropriate data source. And with that, they can't push back. Is that the
I think, I mean, we can't blame the notified bodies for challenging some manufacturers on their wording in general, because it's always connected to what I'm telling them. So they were not part of your data collection. They were not part of your writing all the time. Right. So you give them actually a story, and sometimes the story is reasonable and sounds great. Sometimes it doesn't. And you need to look to your document again and check, did I tell them the right story? Did I share with them the storyline, my conclusion, in a way that they can follow it? And it's a matter of actually continuous joint education on both sides. So the notified bodies might conclude in a way because of your wording, but they might conclude because your evidence were limited. So you need to find the reason. You need to understand why those data are not acceptable. And case by case, it might be either connected to the wrong language that you use, or it might be connected to the data and the quality of the data that you have provided, that they told you we need to have additional European data. So I think we without looking into the deep detail of the case, we cannot give like a general answer. What we can tell that actually US data can be used for the European application if you could show the relevance and the transferability of the data. And if you can show that, then the notified body will not challenge you. But if you just push the data to them without giving them that transferability justification, they will challenge, because they will ask you, how do I know that those data are relevant for Europe, because they were collected under some differences in the US, and you didn't tell me a good story why I can use them for Europe. And this story should be, like I said, not coming from I believe or I hope. It should be coming from scientific sound evidence.
Yeah, agreed. Tell me up ahead of time why this is applicable, that you've looked, that you've assessed it, whether it's demographics or, especially data that's coming from the US. It's a very heterogeneous population. And in some places in Europe, maybe not as much. So if you look at trying to just pull data from Finland compared to Malta, compared to Spain, it's arguable that it's not as heterogeneous. So do that planning ahead of time. And as Dr. Acker said, tell me that story. Tell me you've looked, you've assessed it, and this is why you believe it's generalizable to the EU.
With that, I want to move to our last topic, which is, I think you want to have a matrix, you want to have a checklist, you want to have something, right, as a human to kind of put a period at each of your justifications. But this especially, in assessing population differences and assessing standard of care differences and assessing data differences, this is growing and developing, and where can we look to for guidance, especially when there's going back to the earlier discussion regarding real world data, is there specific guidance available that lets can help you in framing your justification of, okay, these are the points you need to assess for relevance. Here's the key determinations of reliability. Here's what you need to justify. Where do clinical reviewers benchmark justifications, right? When you're getting this information from manufacturers, what are you benchmarking it against? Is there anything available for the user to lean on?
Yeah, this is very challenging. It's a great question, because I'm not aware of any benchmarks specifically that are titled how to use real world data for regulatory decision making. So
not in the EU, or is there?
Not that I'm aware of in the EU. So I will defer to Dr. Acker if he is aware of some, but I certainly don't have any in my toolbox. And so for myself, I look at the data, did they use validated tools, for example? Patient reported outcomes. Again, did you use validated tools for assessing that? And back to, I don't want to keep saying the same thing, but using and approaching it from a scientific background, and continuing to use those principles of having, research background, statistic background, clinical background, and knowing, when we talk about real world data, as you said, I've had decades of experience as a clinician, and really as a notified body, I pull from that experience. So that's for my own personal benchmarking. Wherever possible, like I said, using validated tools is, for me, is very powerful in how I review your data.
Yeah.
Dr. Acker, do you have any? Yeah.
I think, like you said, there is no standard recipe that you can use immediately. We did some publication from our side as well. And we are working on additional publication with RAPS to talk about transferability of data. because it's an important topic. And I think we need to keep in mind that data are data, and data needs to be challenged regardless where those data are collected, under which setting. So if someone will present to me a survey, if someone would present to me real-world evidence, someone would present to me a clinical data collected via a clinical study, I will always challenge the data when I look to what kind of question I need to answer. So I saw actually big randomized studies done for devices where I said, nice try, they don't help. And then the manufacturer was saying, oh, but I invested a lot of money, a lot of time to collect those data. But if you collect the wrong data, or you are using the wrong data, regardless where you did that study, where you collected the data, it doesn't help. So I think what is important when we talk about transferability are two aspects which are relevant: the patient and the user. And those aspects are critical, because if the patient is different, because they have some genetic differences or differences in population, which might impact the device safety and performance, you need to consider that you might not be able to use those data for Europe or for the US. If you have a physician and a clinical practice, which is completely different, they might impact actually also the way how you're going to be, let's say, using the data. Because if the clinical practice in a specific region would require implantation of devices, which is not actually a requirement to implant that device at that stage for a patient population in Europe, then you are actually dealing with a different starting point, which can have an influence on safety and performance. So you need to consider multiple factors. And if you keep those 2 points in mind when you are looking to the data, and you get the answer from the manufacturer, and the answer will come from the literature. You're going to be able to find it from the literature. You're going to be able to find it as well from the intended purpose, indication, patient population, or what the manufacturer is giving in the instruction for use. This would help you actually building that transferability argument. And the most supportive evidence will be the literature, which will allow you to compare data which were collected on a specific device in Europe versus data which were collected in other regions. And you can look to how was the clinical practice, how was the patient selection, how was the output, and you can compare and say, do I have big differences? Do I see big signals which show me that there is an impact on actually my data, and I need to pay attention on a specific aspect? And I think this is the methodologies that everyone would be looking for. It will cost you time, but it is not just actually a single sentence. It's an effort which you need to do to build such a scientific justification, which, depending on the device, depending on the differences, might cost you some pages of explanation, but they are important, because you need to remember a notified body reviewer, a US FDA reviewer, is not sitting with you in your desk and not sitting in your brain. You need to tell the story. And whatever that story will be that you're going to be sharing, it might be a nice story which they can follow, but it could be also a very complex story that no one will buy it. So make sure that you tell the story in a very easy way, simple way, supporting it with scientific evidence, then people will buy it and will take it.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, right? It's about, you know, if it's not understandable, it's not the fault of the reader, it's the fault of the writer. You need to craft that story in a very straightforward way. I wanted to ask, so earlier this year, the US FDA released a draft guidance regarding the data quality expectations of relevance and reliability for real-world data sources specific to medtech. And within that draft guidance, there's a great, essentially they outline a data transferability argument. And they bullet point things that a manufacturer must consider, such as, you know, being able to identify the device, being able to identify the data elements that are going to speak to the outcomes, longitudinally tracing patients. You know, does the data represent current clinical practice, or, you know, is it of an older source? Has the field of medicine changed? What is the data type and the purpose of the collection, and what was done to the data to modify it, for example, for privacy protection? Is there any plan for something similar like that to be created within the EU, or is there ability, you know, given the lack of anything else, is there ability of manufacturers to maybe start to look to that to again build that scientifically valid justification?
I mean, if we look to the European system since the publication of the medical device regulation, I remember in 2017, the European Commission told me when I was at a notified body representing notified bodies, we wrote the regulation in a very lengthy way because we want to avoid guidances. Today, we have hundreds of guidances because it shows actually the necessity for more guidance and guidance. I'm not a big fan of more guidance because more guidance might create more confusion. I'm much more a fan of looking to what is actually already there and try to make use of that without creating more complexity. Because guidance are created by multiple experts from the member state level, plus actually some contribution of MedTech representative and notified bodies, but final decisions are taken by regulators. Taking decision by regulators makes things sometimes not easy. So we need to actually tell them the recipe. So we need to make sure that perhaps notified bodies can look into how they set expectation. So Team NB can create a guidance. It might be much more useful than actually pushing on guidance from MDCG level because they are not dealing with that trouble by themselves. The notified bodies are getting a lot of submissions and they can share their knowledge and their experience and make use of what they saw as a good justification to say those are the elements which we take from the US FDA guidance, plus actually our current experience and set expectation on clinical data transferability approach. I think this would be much more beneficial because like we said before, and we should keep that in mind, data from various sources can be used. There is no requirement to have data in the EU. It might be useful depending on what kind of differences you have from different countries, but at the end, the patient and the physicians are actually everywhere setting the same expectation. We need to make sure that those justifications are included because the relevancy of the data for the European population shall be actually addressed, and this has to be addressed in a specific scientific way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think we want to end on one additional question. We're getting close to time here, but I wanted to make sure we answer this question from an attendee. They stated that it's clear on using US clinical data for EU. Does the same principle apply for legacy devices? So in other words, can the manufacturer validate the generated data with the available literature?
I'm trying to understand. Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question. Go ahead, Doctor.
No, like I said, I mean, it's like I said it before, and I think we answered that multiple times. The literature is your source of justification. Yeah. And because if there is, you can't justify it based on your personal opinion. It has to come from a scientific evidence, and you're going to need to use scientific literature to build that actually connection between the various data sources and explain why the data can be useful for the European patient population.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is legacy device, sometimes with data coming forward, I always look at how old the data is and then being able to justify, is there any change in clinical practice guidelines? Is there any change in the severity of patients being treated? So really take a look at how old that data is. It could still be relevant, but I want to know that you've looked at that. And then also ensuring that you don't mean just complaints when you come forward and with your legacy device and tell me it's been on the market for 20 years and we have low complaints, because I'm going to say across the board, notified bodies have lost confidence in complaint data to really represent safe use of devices. You know, we look at public meshes and hip implants, and we've I think globally have lost our trust in complaint data. It is a great data point, but it is just a data point.
Exactly. Well, thank you both very much for your time today and sharing your insights on these questions. And I want to thank the attendees as well for your time and attention. There is a poll that I think has popped up in the platform asking about what types of topics would you be interested in learning about. We would love to keep this series going. But again, Dr. Basel Akra, Diane Legere, thank you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.